Okay, so today we'll be looking at Heaney's poem North. It is a titular poem, which means it shares the same title as the actual collection North. Heaney's work in the collection North becomes far, far darker. If we look at what's happening in Northern Ireland in 1975, we've had Bloody Sunday, where British troops opened fire on protesters. There's a lot of controversy about it. From Heaney's point of view, this represented the absolute high tide of violence and tribalism. It's worth remembering by this stage, Heaney has moved from Northern Ireland to outside Dublin, and many people who were very strong nationalists in Belfast and in Northern Ireland believe that this was an act of betrayal. I'm going to suggest that that's quite important in understanding this particular poem. The other poems that you're studying that belong in the collection North are Punishment, Groyble Man, Bog Queen, and Act of Union. And in each of these we can see the violence of the past coming to the present, the idea of a northern pagan Viking influence being very important, and of course Heaney's incredible fascination with the bog bodies and the idea of Ireland as being joined to this kind of Scandinavian history. So that's really important, because what precedes, what comes before the Anglo-Norman invasion, because Heaney's often talking about the Normans and the British coming over and committing violence. Of course, an earlier iteration of this is the Vikings, who come again with their warlike traditions, etc. So we begin with the poet in the first person saying he returns to the long strand, and he uses a very unusual verb here. He says, the hammered curve of the bay. Now it's very important that we drill down on this word. Not only do we have this pattern of using the H sounds to really emphasize the violence, we also have the idea of the land itself as being fashioned by tools, and in this case in particular by what appears to be the hammer of Thor. So not only does this link to the kind of violence of the Vikings, it also suggests that the land itself has been imprinted with this history of violence. And here he finds only the secular, so the non-religious powers, almost like we're going back to pagan times, pre-Christian times. And this is something that Heaney likes to do. He likes to show that the present island of Christianity is just in some ways a veneer, and beneath this, of course, lies this history of pagan violence. So we have the use of pathetic fallacy. We've got the Atlantic thundering, so the sea is thundering there. So we have the TH sound, we have the gerund, the ing sound there. So there's this tremendous use of onomatopoeic sounds. Now, looking at the actual verse structure, again, Heaney almost always writes in quatrains, and this time the quatrains are short and pounding quatrains, almost like we feel the pounding of a drum or the beating of a hammer. The short lines really give a sense, don't they, of things happening quickly and rhythmically. He then in stanza number 2 says, I face the unmagical invitations. So he looks at Iceland, and what's quite interesting is that frequently Irish writers would try to look beyond Britain to Europe, to Catholic Europe, where they felt at home. But Heaney's kind of reorientating us and making Irish readers in particular think of their relationship to the North and to this history of pagan violence, etc. He calls it unmagical, and he speaks of the pathetic colonies. Here he's using the proper sense, or the old-fashioned sense of the word pathos, sad and moving and broken. And so there too we see the effects of violence. Now, the power of the poem rests upon the fact that the reader is expected to understand the allegory, to understand that the violence that he speaks of in the past, this Viking violence, has direct parallels with what is going on in Ireland, with this endless feud and violence that is everywhere, that he sees as kind of synonymous with the Viking history. As I say here, he uses a great deal of enjambment. The lines work very, very quickly, and if we see across these 4 stanzas on this entire page, there are no end stops. And that really is very powerful, because it gives us a sense of a fast rhythm, almost like an invasion, people coming over. And the enjambment gives you a sense of how fast, almost inevitable, that this is happening. And of course, this must be how Heaney feels about events in 1975 in Ireland, where things have been unleashed, and it seems as though there's no stopping. So he switches, and he speaks of the fabulous raiders. Now, this is one of the only positive adjectives that there is. But of course, fabulous can have 2 meanings. We might mean it today in a vernacular sense to mean really cool or awesome. But it can also derive from the idea of a fable, or something which is actually imaginary. And he speaks here of them lying in Orkney and Dublin. So here they are, they're dead bodies, and they surround Ireland. The Orkney Isles are off the coast of Scotland, but close to Ireland. In Dublin, the bodies of the Vikings lie. This is another very important verb, measured against their long rusting swords. Now, in terms of lines to really dig down on, to drill down on, and to tease out meaning, this is a superb one, and there are probably 3 that I'm going to draw your attention to. Measured is how they defined themselves. They measured themselves by their swords, by their killing. That was the creed that they lived by. But here they are corpses, and you'll notice that their swords are rusting. Now, of course, part of the rusting is that they are of the past, but it also suggests a kind of impotence to the violence, doesn't it? It kind of reduces the glamour of the violence and to the whole creed that they have of being great warriors, etc. In the next verse, and once again, I just want to emphasize how quick the rhythm is going, how this enjambment is working, and how the lines are really running into one another. In the belly, this personification of the ships here, there's a really interesting piece of oxymoron here, because the belly is soft, it's tissue, it's human, but the ships are stone. Now, in reality, stone ships would sink. But not only is he going to use the sibilants here, this alliteration, which is really powerful, along with the H sounds, which I spoke about before, words like hacked and hammered feature very prominently in this poem because they have connotations of violence and they produce the right sound, together with the gerunds and the G here of glinting, which makes it sound as though it's a knife edge or a sword with light coming off it. Well, what's so interesting here is that you have this oxymoron between the stone ships and the flesh. And this really is something that makes it a very, very powerful moment. Now, when we move on to the next stanza, we have the idea of the ocean-deafened voices warning me. Well, what's really interesting here is that you get the sense that there's so much noise and violence that it is really almost impossible to hear this particular voice. And this voice is kind of spoken by people, unnamed, anonymous people in the past. But it serves as a kind of prophecy, a warning, which is really important. And that is a big theme in a lot of Heaney's work, is this idea of warning and prophecy. So we have the ocean-deafened voices, but he does, fortunately, get to hear them because they lift again in violence and epiphany. Epiphany is a beautiful Greek word. It means the showing of the Spirit. So it's when you have a moment of intense realization and meaning. And it finally stops here. And we switch over to this glorious picture of these magnificent Viking boats. The long ships with their swimming tongue. What's interesting, though, of course, is the boats have nothing to say. The tongue doesn't actually produce language. It actually produces violence instead. But here Heaney tells us that the tongue is speaking, that it's buoyant with hindsight. Well, now that all the violence is done, etc., it can serve as a warning to us when we look back at this history of violence and tribalism. It was Thor's hammer swung to geography and trade. And this is what he remembers: thick-witted couplings. So in other words, like kind of mindless, unpleasant sex and revenge. These are people who are acting out of pure emotion. There seems to be nothing that we would call civilization in it. They act out of anger, emotion, and irrationality. The hatreds and behind backs of the Ulsting. So this, of course, is the Icelandic parliament, okay? But it doesn't really sound like a parliament, does it? Because things are not getting discussed here. All it is hatred, etc. And this, of course, reflects on the politics of the present, because there is no kind of communication or diplomacy that is possible in this milieu of absolute violence. So the violence of the Ulting here in Iceland seems to represent the politics of Stormond in Northern Ireland, where people have given up talking and instead they're fighting and killing. And we have exhaustion's nominated peace. Well, at this point now, we don't have that exhaustion yet. This is what happened in the past. What we have here, and this is a beautiful line that I've highlighted, we have memory incubating the spilled blood. This is a stunning line before we have the end stop here, because memory incubates. So when we think about the connotations of the word incubate, what we're thinking about is things like fertility, reproduction, a bird sitting on a nest, growing young. But here it's not going to manufacture young or organic life. It's incubating the spilled blood. And by incubating it, what it's going to do is make sure that there's more blood, almost in a kind of vampiric sense, where this society will breed further violence. And that really is a terrifying thought for Heaney. So we have the end stop here. It's really important because this is our moment, this is our volta. When we switch to the end of the poem to the coda, and we switch from this big picture history thing of the past that amalgamates with the present to the voice speaking to the poet Heaney. And in this sense, we see a very strong influence of Romanticism and the idea that the Romantics had that the poet was really important. Shelley, the Romantic poet, talked about poets being the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And Heaney too seems to give great importance and validity to poetry. Let's not forget that many of his critics said, Heaney, you're not doing enough for nationalism. We want you to write poems that will inspire resistance and freedom fighting. And to many strong nationalists, to many strong political people, Heaney's poems were too cryptic. They were too allegorical. They did not directly address what was happening out there. And here the voice seems to support Heaney, and it kind of gives him comfort. It says, and all of a sudden you see the tone change from all of this violence. You see that the rhythm retards here, it slows down here. Listen to the words, lie down in the word hoard. See that compounded word with the strong assonance there, the oo sounds and the burrow. So it's a kind of comforting, get beneath the earth, the coil and gleam of your furrowed brain. So this means go inside yourself. And in terms of linking, I'm very much thinking of a link to personal halakon, where Heaney talks about wells, and at the bottom of the well, he sees himself, his kind of unconscious mind, and he makes a reference to Narcissus. Now, some people might say that that's a very negative, that's self-obsession, but here Heaney is saying, actually, the poet must go inside himself, that this is the place where he can create and maybe see things that people can't see in the violence of the present. Now, it says here, It's ordering him to do his art. Compose in darkness. So it kind of says, accept your loneliness. You're not going to have light, etc. Expect the aurora borealis, the northern lights in the long foray, but no cascade of light. So nothing is going to happen quickly. There's not going to be this great, amazing moment of revelations. This is a slow and laborious process. Now, in terms of other poems that I'd like to link to there, I'm thinking of linking to Westering, where the poet goes out on a drive and he has to absorb the countryside and the majesty and the sublimeness of the countryside in order to create, in order to find the words. So again, here we have an idea that artistic creation is slow, it's deliberate, it takes time, it sometimes means closing yourself off from all of the voices around you. And now we get into the final stanza. Keep your eye clear, and the bleb of the icicle. As clear as the bleb of the icicle. Bleb is an interesting word because it actually means a liquid-filled blister. So there's almost like a sense of a wound there, but at the same time, it has kind of quite a triumphant tone, as though Heaney is here being ordered to have an authentic artistic vision that can overcome all of the noise and the deafening ocean and the violence of history. And instead, he needs to act in a visionary way. And this is completely supported by the final line that I really, really want you to emphasize and to know. Trust the feel of what nub treasure your hands have known. Now, this is very triumphant, and again I'm going to emphasize this kind of link to romanticism, to the idea that the poet can actually sometimes rise above the conflicts of the present and create things that will get people to have more vision and maybe to go beyond the tribalism that they feel. Please remember that Heaney used the pen name Incertus, uncertain one. Now again, that's why a lot of nationalist poets criticized him, nationalist thinkers. They wanted someone who chose sides. But Heaney didn't want to do this. He is a nationalist, and he believes in Ireland and a united Ireland. But he's not sure about this violence and this hatred. And we can see this from this poem, can't we? What does he believe in if he doesn't believe in this kind of liberation violence? He believes in what he calls the nub treasure, which of course is his pen. So this is a great validation of his role as poet. He sees it as far superior to the hands that carry a gun and shoot bullets. So the nub treasure, of course, is the ability to create words and to be able to describe this conflict. So what does this poem do? What does North do? It is a warning of the violence of the past and how we can be trapped in a cycle of violence and how we can not be able to see beyond this. And of course, how do we get out of this from Heaney's point of view? We get out of it sometimes by retreating from it. Now, on a biographical level, we know that he's retreated to a cottage outside of Dublin where he's writing. He's retreated from the scene where most of the violence is happening. And here, in his poetry, he is trying to find the words to capture the conflict. So like the voice that's warning him of the violence, this poem serves to warn its readers that this violence will continue unless people can see beyond the confines of the present, the hatreds and the vengeances. Thank you so much for listening.